Hey guys, this chapter will be over conditioning and learning, or learning and conditioning, whichever way you want to put those. This is a chapter that's a lot more complicated, so it's a little bit harder to do just like over video. It's easier to do in person as far as like giving examples and using a board and stuff like that, so just bear with me on this. And you'll also need to use this for this chapter specifically for the fall assessment. So just remember like to really look through the material in this chapter from the book, and also listen to this video. But first of all, what is learning? Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior, and it's because of some type of experience, whether it's something that we experience like physically ourselves, or something that we're taught, like maybe what we're doing right now. It's a relatively permanent change in behavior. There's associative learning, which is when you form associations between stimuli, and with associative learning you've got two different types. You've got classical and operant conditioning. These are the two types we'll talk about. Classical is when it's a learning based on reflexes, whenever it comes to new stimuli, and then you've got operant conditioning, and that's whenever, operant conditioning is learning by consequences. So in both cases you respond to the stimuli. Classical is more reflexive learning, and operant conditioning, that's learning by consequences. You have sensitization and habituation. Sensitization, that's whenever you are sensitive to a stimuli, usually a new stimuli. Not all the time, but most of the time it's a new stimuli. You're really hypersensitive to it, whereas habituation, you're not sensitive to it at all. You don't respond to it because maybe you've seen it because it's happened so many times. Just like, for instance, if you have that one friend who is always being dramatic and just yelling and telling a story that's so crazy and whatnot, like you just might get to the point where you just ignore it. You just don't really respond to it because you've been around it so many different times. Or like in this case, another case, you could use like a smell of a candle. Now, the first time you might light up a candle, you might be really sensitive to it and maybe really enjoy it, but the more you use it, the less responsive you're going to be, because it just becomes normal. You're exposed to it a lot more, so you're not going to notice it as much. You're not going to have a response to it as much. Then there's also observational learning, another type of learning we'll talk about. That's where you learn by modeling others. We'll get into classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov, and he studied dogs, and I've got it written down here in bullets. I'm gonna just go through these bullets, one by one, because with this, that would be the easiest thing to do. So, he wanted to study digestion in dogs. So he put dogs in a harness and placed a small amount of food on their tongues. Then after that, he arranged a tube to carry the saliva from the dog's mouth to a lever that activated a recording device. He was able to measure their flow of saliva by doing that. Eventually, he noticed the dogs began to salivate even before the food had reached their mouths, and thereafter, he started to notice that even when he just entered the room. So they associated whenever they were going to use that, they were to use that tube. They eventually got to where they associated that with him, with food, and then also just him entering the room, because they knew he was the one that was going to do that he was going to give them the food. So they started salivating even before the food, even before the tube was used, eventually at one point. So what he did was, after that, he rang a bell, and the bell was neutral at this point. It didn't mean anything to the dogs. They didn't get any response from them. So then after that, he put immediately after he rang the bell, he put meat powder on their tongues, and it caused a reflex. So when rang the bell, put the meat powder on, they salivated. Then he did it again, rang the bell, put the meat powder on, and they salivated. So they were conditioned to starting to salivate when they heard the bell, because they knew right after the bell came that the meat powder was going to come. So because of hearing of that, they learned that hearing the bell that they were going to get some type of meat, some type of food. So they would start salivating even before the food touched their tongue. The bell evoked the same response as the food. They salivated both times. And it got to the point where even whenever they rang the bell and didn't give them food, they still salivated, because they had made that association with that now. So you had food, and you got a response, and you got the salivation. Then you had the bell, you got the response of salivation, even without the food. So, but whenever we look at this, you've got different things. You've got unconditioned stimulus, or the US, and that's a stimulus that's capable of eliciting a response. And in that case, it would have been, oh crap, sorry. Well, actually, I've got some other examples besides Pavlov I'll use for this. But you got unconditioned stimulus, which stimulus that just automatically creates a response. Unconditioned response and a reflex elicited by the unconditioned stimulus. You've got neutral stimulus, which does not evoke any kind of response. It's just there. Like in the example, the bell was neutral stimulus at first. Then you had conditioned stimulus that evokes a response because it's been repeatedly paired with the US. And then you've got the conditioned response, which is a learned response elicited. So let's say, for instance, whenever it comes to, well, you know what, we'll go ahead and do Pavlov's example. So the unconditioned stimulus in that was the food. It automatically created a response of salivation, created a response whenever it was placed on the dog's tongue. The unconditioned response was salivation. Once they got the food, they salivated, and that happened automatically. The neutral stimulus was the bell, which then became the conditioned stimulus. One thing to remember is that the neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus. So like I said, the bell was neutral, but then it became associated with food, so it became the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response was the same. It was salivation. So another example, let's say that you have a puff of air that's like blown into your eye. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to blink. So in this case, the air would be the unconditioned stimulus, and the blinking of the eye would be the unconditioned response. Let's say then you decided to blow a horn. Obviously, that's not going to have an effect. That's the neutral stimulus. But then eventually it gets to a point where you blow the horn. Then you put the puff of air into the eye, and then it blinks. You repeat that a few times. So then once you blow the horn, it becomes a conditioned stimulus, because it conditions the person to blink their eye, because they learn to associate, okay, the horn's going to come, then the puff of air, and then they blink. So that's some more when it comes to classical conditioning. There's a lot of other things with classical conditioning, but I'm not going to go over those in this. You can look over the chapter and look at them that way. I do want to go ahead and move to operant conditioning. And with operant conditioning, like I said, it's based on consequences. You learn based on consequences, whereas classical conditioning, you learn based on association. Operant is based directly on consequences. And what they came up with, Edward Thorndike, his law of effect states that whenever responses that lead to something desirable or positive are likely to be repeated, whereas responses that lead to something negative are less likely to be repeated. So basically, if something's positive, it's likely to be repeated. If it's negative, it's not likely to be repeated. Simple, right? Real simple. So Skinner made what he called the Skinner box, and he designed it to study animals. And basically, in it, he went to where he had a lever and he had a rat inside. He had a lever. The rat pushed the lever, and it delivered the rat either a pellet of food or some water. So the rat eventually learned, okay, I push this, I'm going to get food or water. Well, eventually, like he would switch it up some. He would do it to where he had to press it so many different times, the rat did, to be able to get the food or the water, no matter how many times. Or, sometimes he changed it to where it was in intervals, where every 10 minutes, no matter how many times the rat could push the lever 100 times, but every 10 minutes is whenever it would give you food or water. So sometimes he would change it up, and the rat would learn this as well. Would learn that it was based on time interval or based on number of times you would have to push the bar, the lever. So when it comes to operant conditioning, we've got different types of reinforcement. We have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, it's defined as it occurs when a response is followed by a reward or other positive event. So, for instance, let's say a kid goes and cleans the kitchen without being asked to. They go through and clean the countertops, cleans the floor, wipes the walls down, cleans the stove, microwave, whatever. They do that, and then they might get a reward. They might get an allowance, or a surprise allowance, or something like that. So they say, okay, well, if I do that again without being asked, I'm probably going to get something else. I'm probably going to get a reward based on that. So because it was a positive consequence, then they're more likely to repeat it. Whereas, let's say, like, if they were to go through and do all that and then they don't get any kind of reward, or they barely get a thanks, then they're probably not going to do it again, right? Which most kids wouldn't want to clean the kitchen anyways, but that's the first thing that popped into my mind. Negative reinforcement, meanwhile, it occurs when a response is followed by an end to discomfort or by the removal of an unpleasant event. So let's say, for instance, I'll give an example here. Let's say you're wearing a shoe and you have a rock in your shoe. You're walking around, it's very uncomfortable, right? Well, if you go to remove your rock, you go to remove the rock from your shoe, then you walk again and it's real comfortable. It's good. That's negative reinforcement. Some people might say, well, why is that negative? How is that negative? Because it results in something positive. It's negative because you're taking away the thing that's causing the discomfort. So, like, for instance, you have the rock in the shoe, you take the rock out, and you're removing something. You're removing the negative part from it, which is the rock. So it's negative reinforcement. I know it's kind of confusing. I always had trouble when I first dealt with it too. And like I said, this is kind of parts that are kind of like difficult to do like over video instead of being in person, being able to physically like show you and help you. But that's an example for that. There's also positive punishment and negative punishment, which I'll actually get into in the next video. I'll stop it here.